For 7 years, I lived under the illusion that Kayla and I were the perfect couple. We had everything: shared dreams, effortless laughter, and a connection I thought was unbreakable. But recently, things had started to shift. The warmth in her smile seemed forced, her touch colder. She laughed less, spoke less, and when she did, her words carried an edge they hadn't before. At first, I told myself it was stress. Work had been relentless for both of us, and the demands of everyday life had grown heavier. But no matter how much I rationalized, the unease stayed with me, lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then came the late-night calls. Kayla and her best friend, Mary, had always been close, but now their conversations felt different. She'd slip into the bedroom, her voice dropping to a near whisper. If I asked what they were discussing, she'd wave me off with a vague excuse about catching up or needing advice. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I stood quietly outside the door, her words muffled but clear enough to understand. Mary's tone was calm, but assertive, almost instructive. Kayla's responses were punctuated with agreement, her voice carrying a strange mix of eagerness and hesitation. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept circling back to what I'd heard, or rather, what I felt I had heard. I didn't know what they were planning, but it didn't feel harmless. The warmth that had once defined our marriage was being replaced by something colder, more calculated. Whatever was going on, I knew I couldn't let it slide. I needed to figure it out, but subtly. This wasn't the kind of thing that would come to light with a simple question over dinner. After that night, I started paying closer attention. Kayla's behavior became a puzzle I couldn't stop trying to solve. She'd gotten better at masking whatever was going on, but the signs were still there if you looked hard enough. The way she'd glance at her phone and quickly turn the screen away, or how she'd linger over texts, smiling faintly. She'd begun working late more often, always with a convincing excuse, yet her explanations left me uneasy. At home, she was distant but oddly accommodating. She'd make my favorite meals, ask about my day, and laugh at my jokes, but it all felt rehearsed. Her warmth was there, but only on the surface, like she was trying to keep up appearances. It was like living with a stranger who wore my wife's face. The weekends didn't help. Kayla, who used to love spending lazy Sundays with me, had developed a sudden interest in social outings with Mary. "It's good for me," she'd say, brushing off my offer to join. "You should relax. You work so hard during the week." The way she said it almost felt like a pat on the head, a dismissal dressed as concern. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe she really did need more time with friends. But her explanations always felt too perfect, too prepared. And when I'd catch her staring off into the distance, her expression unreadable, I couldn't help but wonder what was really going through her mind. The space between us kept growing, and for the first time in our marriage, I started to feel truly alone. Still, I kept my suspicions to myself. I knew that if I accused her without proof, she'd turn it around on me. Kayla was too sharp, too quick on her feet. I had to bide my time and gather something concrete. Until then, I played my role, the supportive husband, the oblivious partner. But inside, the doubts were eating me alive. The tipping point came one Thursday night when Kayla left for another last-minute meeting with Mary. Something about her excuse didn't sit right. She'd been vague about where they were going, and when I asked for details, her answers felt rushed, like she was eager to avoid the conversation altogether. After she left, I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but my gut was screaming at me that this wasn't just paranoia. I waited a few minutes, then grabbed my keys and drove in the direction she had gone. She was predictable in her routes, and sure enough, I spotted her car parked outside a trendy bar downtown, far from where she said she'd be. From across the street, I watched as she stepped out of her car and met someone at the entrance. It wasn't Mary. It was a man, tall, well-dressed, and unmistakably familiar. I couldn't place him at first, but then it hit me. He was a co-worker of hers, someone she'd casually mentioned in passing before. I stayed in my car, heart pounding, as they entered the bar together. They were close, their body language speaking volumes. This wasn't just two colleagues meeting for drinks. There was an ease between them that told me this wasn't their first time. I didn't follow them inside. I couldn't. The sight of her with someone else was enough to make me feel physically ill. Instead, I sat in the car trying to process what I'd just seen. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was Mary covering for her? And most painfully, why? When Kayla finally came home hours later, she acted as though nothing had happened. She kissed my cheek, asked if I'd eaten, and even laughed at a dumb joke I made. It was so normal, so effortless, that for a brief second, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. It was real, and I needed to face it. Still, I kept quiet. I couldn't confront her yet, not without undeniable proof. If I called her out now, she'd deny everything, spin it as a misunderstanding, and somehow turn it back on me. I needed to play it smart. I needed evidence. That night, as Kayla slept soundly beside me, I made a decision. I was going to find out everything. No more guessing, no more hoping I was wrong. Whatever she was hiding, I was going to uncover it. And when I did, there'd be no going back. The next morning, I woke up with a grim sense of purpose. I had crossed the line the night before by following Kayla, but I didn't regret it. If anything, it only confirmed what I needed to do. I wasn't going to sit back and let her deceive me any longer. At work, I spent my lunch break researching ways to uncover the truth. I wasn't tech-savvy, but I learned enough to get started. By the end of the day, I had ordered a few discrete tools: a phone cloning device, a couple of small cameras, and a GPS tracker. The tracker, I decided, would go under her car, while the cameras would be hidden in our bedroom and living room, places where she often took her calls. When the packages arrived a few days later, I felt a mix of determination and dread. I knew I was crossing into territory I never thought I'd find myself in, but I told myself it was necessary. If Kayla was lying to me, I needed to know. That night, while she was showering, I planted the tracker under her car and hid one of the cameras on a high shelf in the living room. The other camera went inside our bedroom, carefully concealed among some books on her nightstand. It was a calculated risk. If she found any of these, it would spark a confrontation I wasn't ready for. But I had a chance at it. I also managed to sync her phone with mine. It wasn't easy, but I'd seen her password enough times to guess it. Once I had access, I combed through her recent messages and call logs. Nothing overtly incriminating stood out, but there were gaps in her conversations. Long periods where no messages were sent or received. It didn't add up. As I delved deeper, I noticed a contact listed under a generic name: work. The messages were sparse, but the tone was too personal for a simple colleague. My stomach turned as I read phrases like, "Last night was amazing," and "Can't wait to see you again." I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had more. So, I waited, watching the GPS tracker's data and reviewing the camera footage daily. The guilt of spying on her weighed on me, but every new piece of information hardened my resolve. Kayla, oblivious to my actions, continued her routine. She laughed at my jokes, made dinner, and even suggested we plan a weekend getaway. It felt like a cruel game she was playing, but I forced myself to go along with it. The better I played my role, the less likely she'd suspect anything. But as I reviewed the footage one night, I stumbled on something that changed everything. While I was at work, she had taken a phone call in the living room, her voice low but urgent. The camera captured her pacing back and forth, her words clipped. "I told you it's under control. He doesn't suspect a thing." My blood ran cold. She was talking about me. Hearing those words, "He doesn't suspect a thing," was like a punch to the gut. Kayla's voice had been calm, assured, like she was confident she could keep the wool pulled over my eyes indefinitely. I replayed the footage several times, my hands trembling. Who was she talking to? And how deep did this deception run? I decided to focus on the tracker data next. Most of her movements seemed normal. Trips to work, the grocery store, the occasional visit to Mary's. But every few days, she'd stop at a location that didn't make sense, a small boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a place you'd stop by casually, and she spent hours there each time. By now, my suspicions were no longer just suspicions. I was staring at the truth, even if I didn't have the full picture yet. Still, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Watching from a distance wasn't enough anymore. The next time the tracker pinged her at the hotel, I left work early, claiming a headache. Parking down the street from the hotel, I waited. Her car was in the lot, parked neatly near the entrance. For nearly an hour, I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to summon the courage to go inside. Part of me didn't want to know what I'd find. The other part needed to. Eventually, the door opened, and she stepped out. She wasn't alone. The man from the bar was with her, his arm casually draped around her shoulders. They laughed as they walked to her car, completely at ease, as if they had nothing to hide. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I watched. They parted ways after a lingering goodbye, and I followed her home, staying far enough behind to avoid suspicion. When I walked in the door that evening, Kayla greeted me like nothing had happened. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and asked about my day. Her lies were so seamless, so practiced, that for a moment, I almost admired her ability to keep up the facade. As we sat down to dinner, I couldn't help but study her. Every word she said felt calculated, every gesture part of an act. She was wearing a necklace I didn't recognize, small, gold, with a tiny heart pendant. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't something I had given her. The next morning, I checked the tracker again. She had gone back to the hotel late at night, after I'd fallen asleep. I wondered how long she planned to keep this up, how long she thought she could play me for a fool. What she didn't know was that the fool was starting to fight back. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and pretense. Kayla went about her usual routine, utterly unaware of the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. I was careful not to let anything slip. No hints, no sudden changes in behavior. If she sensed even a flicker of suspicion, she'd adapt, and I couldn't afford that. Not now. I spent my evenings meticulously planning my next steps. It wasn't enough to know she was cheating. I needed to gather irrefutable proof. If and when I confronted her, I wanted her to have no room for denial, no escape from the truth. I adjusted the cameras and set up alerts on the tracker to notify me immediately whenever she returned to the boutique hotel. Each new piece of evidence was cataloged: screenshots of texts, GPS logs, and now video clips of her whispered conversations. The footage from our living room had proven particularly damning. She spoke to her lover in a tone I hadn't heard from her in years, soft, playful, intimate. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger. But the most painful moment came when I found another journal entry on her bedside table, left carelessly open one morning. My curiosity got the better of me, and I skimmed the page. It was an entry about her journey of self-discovery, littered with phrases like "Jack will understand," and "this is for the best." The audacity of it all was almost laughable. She genuinely believed she was doing me a favor by lying, cheating, and manipulating me. It was as though she'd convinced herself that her betrayal was some grand act of love, a necessary evil for the sake of our future. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, the weight of it all pressed down on me. The lies, the betrayal, the sheer selfishness. It was overwhelming. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? What did he have that I didn't? And why had she chosen to destroy what we had? But as painful as it was, it also solidified my resolve. If she thought she could control the narrative, she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. My opportunity came sooner than I expected. That Friday, Kayla announced that she'd be spending the evening at Mary's for a girls' night. She made a show of packing an overnight bag, even tossing in a bottle of wine I'd bought for us. The familiarity of her routine was almost insulting. It was the same performance she'd used countless times before. This time, though, I wouldn't be sitting at home, wondering what she was up to. I had a plan, and by the end of the night, I'd be one step closer to ending this charade once and for all. As soon as she left, I grabbed my coat and keys, my heart pounding with anticipation. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was about to witness the truth firsthand. I followed her from a distance, careful not to get too close. Her car weaved through the streets with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. She didn't head to Mary's house as she claimed, but instead took the familiar route to the boutique hotel. The sight of her car pulling into the lot tightened a knot in my stomach. I parked a block away and walked to the hotel, keeping to the shadows. The lobby was small and dimly lit, with a single clerk at the desk who barely glanced up as I slipped inside. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the room. There was no sign of her, but I knew where she'd be. I spotted the elevator and hesitated. Did I really want to see this? A part of me still hoped I was wrong, that maybe this was all some misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew the truth, and I had to face it. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, my reflection staring back at me in the polished metal walls. I hit the button for the third floor, the one her tracker always pinged, and took a deep breath. My hands were clammy, and my legs felt like lead, but there was no turning back now. When the doors opened, the hallway was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I checked the room numbers as I walked, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Finally, I found it. Room 314. Her car had been parked outside for almost half an hour, so there was no doubt she was here. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Part of me wanted to kick it down and confront them both, to unleash the rage and betrayal that had been building inside me. But I knew better. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to gather proof. I stepped back and took out my phone, snapping a photo of the room number and texting it to the private investigator I'd hired. Room 314, I typed. She's inside. Handle it. The response came almost immediately. Got it. We're on our way. Satisfied, I slipped back down the hallway and took the stairs to the lobby. Outside, I leaned against my car, the cool night air doing little to calm the storm inside me. I stayed there, waiting, my thoughts a chaotic mess of anger, sadness, and grim determination. It didn't take long for the investigator to arrive. He gave me a curt nod before heading inside with his team. They were professionals, discreet and thorough, and I trusted them to do what needed to be done. As I waited, I replayed the events of the past few weeks in my mind. The lies, the secrecy, the casual cruelty of it all. Kayla had thought she could manipulate me, control me, shape me into someone who would accept her betrayal without question. She had underestimated me. When the investigator returned, his expression was grim but efficient. "We got everything," he said, handing me a folder. Photos, videos, audio. "It's all there." I took the folder, my hands trembling. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As I drove home that night, the folder sat on the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. I didn't open it, not yet. I wasn't ready to see the proof of her betrayal laid out in black and white. But I knew one thing for certain: the game was over. The next move was mine. The next morning, I sat in my office at home with the folder in front of me. I hadn't touched it since the investigator handed it over. I stared at it for what felt like hours, dreading what I would find, but knowing I couldn't ignore it. The truth was in there, waiting to destroy whatever illusion of my marriage I had left. Finally, I opened it. The first photo stopped me cold. It was Kayla, her arm around the man I'd seen at the hotel, her smile wide and genuine in a way I hadn't seen in years. They looked like a couple, comfortable and carefree. The next photos were worse. Images of them entering the room, her leaning into him, his hand casually resting on her back. And then the ones from inside the room, blurred but damning. The videos followed. The investigator had been thorough, capturing their conversations through a recording device slipped under the door. Her voice was clear, confident. She spoke about me like I was a minor inconvenience, someone who'd never suspect a thing. She laughed when he joked about how gullible I must be, and her laughter hit harder than any insult ever could. By the time I finished reviewing everything, I felt hollow. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the callousness, the complete disregard for me as a person. Kayla wasn't just lying to me. She was mocking me, treating our marriage like a burden she could discard at will. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions while she carried on as if nothing had changed. She cooked breakfast, asked about my plans for the weekend, and even suggested we watch a movie that night. Her ability to lie so seamlessly was both impressive and horrifying. That evening, I excused myself, saying I had work to catch up on. She didn't press the issue, retreating to the living room with her phone in hand. I watched her from the doorway, her face illuminated by the screen, her fingers typing away with the same ease she used to deceive me. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Kayla," I called, my voice steady but firm. She looked up startled. "Yeah, I need to talk to you about something," I said, gesturing for her to join me in the kitchen. She hesitated for a moment before setting her phone down and following me. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone light but cautious. I placed a folder on the table between us. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to me. "What's that?" she asked, feigning curiosity. "Open it," I said simply. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. Finally, she flipped it open, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she took in the photos and transcripts. Her face drained of color, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Jack, I can explain," she stammered, her voice trembling. I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't. I've heard enough of your lies. Just answer one question for me. Why?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, her mask was slipping, and the person underneath was someone I barely recognized. Kayla froze, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the right words. It was a side of her I'd never seen before: hesitation, vulnerability, even fear. She finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she stumbled over her excuses. "Jack, it's not what it looks like," she started. "I was feeling lost," and Mary said. I cut her off with a sharp laugh, bitter and humorless. "Mary said?" "Of course she did. Go on, Kayla. Blame Mary. Blame your feelings. Blame anyone but yourself." Her expression hardened, her fear giving way to defensiveness. "You don't understand. I've been under so much pressure, work, home, everything. I felt like I was suffocating." And she stopped abruptly, realizing too late she had said more than she intended. "He what?" I demanded, my voice low but cold. "Made you feel alive? Gave you something I couldn't?" She flinched, but her silence told me everything I needed to know. She was searching for a way to justify the unjustifiable, to twist the narrative until she came out looking like the victim. "You have no idea what it's like," she said finally, her voice rising. "To feel trapped, to feel like you've lost yourself. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Jack. I was just trying to find me." I stared at her, incredulous. "By lying to me? By sneaking around behind my back? That's how you find yourself?" Her eyes darted to the folder on the table, as if she could will it to disappear. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "I just needed more time." "Time for what?" I asked, my voice cutting through her weak defense. "To see how long you could string me along? To see if I'd notice? Or were you waiting until I found out on my own, so you wouldn't have to admit it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she sat there, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her gaze fixed on the photos as if they held the answers she couldn't give. "I gave you everything," I continued, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I trusted you, Kayla. I believed in you. And this is how you repay me? By treating me like a fool." Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "Don't act like you're perfect, Jack. You're so busy being the good husband that you don't even see me anymore. I've been lonely for years, and you never noticed." Her words hit harder than I expected, but I refused to let her twist the blame. "If you were lonely, you could have talked to me," I said. "If you were unhappy, you could have told me. Instead, you chose to lie, to cheat, and to humiliate me. That's not on me, Kayla. That's on you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy with anger, pain, and the weight of everything left unsaid. Then, as if realizing she had no way out, Kayla leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I needed to think, to process everything. But one thing was certain. Our marriage would never be the same again. Kayla's question hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to decide our future on the spot. But I wasn't ready to give her an answer. Not yet. I needed time to think, to process the avalanche of emotions that had buried me since opening that folder. "What happens now?" I repeated, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "That's the real question, isn't it? What do you think should happen, Kayla?" She looked startled, clearly expecting me to take the lead. She began but faltered. "Jack, I don't want to lose you. I know I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I interrupted, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. This wasn't a mistake, Kayla. It was a choice. And you made it over and over again." She flinched, but I pressed on. "You had every opportunity to stop, to tell me the truth, but you didn't. Instead, you lied. You looked me in the eye every day and pretended nothing was wrong. So, forgive me if I don't buy the sudden remorse." Her gaze dropped to the table, her fingers twisting nervously. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said softly. "It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "It just happened? That's your excuse? Do you think I'm stupid, Kayla? That I don't see how calculated this all was? The texts, the meetups, the hotel, none of that just happened. You planned it." "I didn't plan to hurt you," she snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "I was trying to figure things out, to find some way to feel alive again." "And what about me?" I shot back. "What was I supposed to do while you were off, finding yourself? Sit at home and wait for you to decide whether I was still good enough for you?" The room fell silent again, the tension between us almost suffocating. Kayla's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked genuinely defeated. But I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. "I need time," I said finally. "Time to figure out what I want, what's best for me. Because for once, Kayla, this isn't about you." She looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and fear. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, standing up, "that I'm not going to make this easy for you. You don't get to cry and apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. You broke this, Kayla. Now you have to live with the consequences." Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the damning evidence of her betrayal. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally regaining control, not just of the situation, but of my life. I spent that night in the guest room, a place I'd rarely used before, but now felt like a refuge. Kayla didn't knock or call for me, and I didn't expect her to. The weight of our confrontation hung heavy in the air, and I suspected she was giving me space out of fear rather than respect. Lying there in the dark, I stared at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying over and over in my mind. Her excuses, her deflection, her audacity to pin her choices on being lost. It all churned in my chest, a volatile mix of anger and sorrow. There had been a time when her pain would have moved me, when I would have reached for her hand and tried to help her fix whatever was broken. But now, I wasn't sure if I cared to fix anything at all. The next morning was quiet. Too quiet. I woke up to the sound of muffled movement in the kitchen and the faint clink of dishes being put away. Kayla was clearly trying to carry on as if life hadn't shifted beneath our feet. But when I entered the kitchen, the tension was palpable. She glanced at me briefly, her face pale and drawn, then quickly looked away. "Coffee's fresh," she murmured, barely audible. I ignored her, pouring myself a cup and taking it to the living room. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the occasional scrape of her chair or the sound of her rinsing plates. She was moving around like a ghost, her usual confidence replaced with hesitation. It was a stark contrast to the woman who had sat across from me last night, defiant even in the face of her lies. Part of me wanted to confront her again, to demand answers to the questions that had been circling my mind since this all began. How long had she been seeing him? Did she ever plan on stopping? But another part of me was exhausted. I didn't want to hear more excuses, more attempts to spin her betrayal into something palatable. Instead, I retreated to my office, burying myself in work. It was easier to focus on spreadsheets and emails than to face the mess that was my marriage. Every time I heard her footsteps pass by, I tensed, waiting for her to knock or try to talk to me. But she didn't. By the time evening rolled around, the tension in the house was unbearable. Kayla finally broke the silence, standing in the doorway of my office with a tentative look on her face. "Jack," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I looked up from my computer, my expression unreadable. "Talk about what?" "About us. About what happens next." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "I already told you I need time." She hesitated, her hands fidgeting nervously. I want to know if you're willing to try. To work through this." Her words stirred something in me. Not anger, but something colder. Resignation. "Work through what?" I asked. "Your betrayal? Your lies? You don't just snap your fingers and fix something like this, Kayla." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly, retreating without another word. As she left, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, she didn't have the upper hand. The days that followed were a strange limbo. Kayla and I coexisted under the same roof, careful not to cross paths more than necessary. She stuck to her routines, cooking, cleaning, working, like she was trying to prove she was still the perfect wife. But the cracks were showing. Her movements were hesitant, her eyes darting nervously whenever we were in the same room. I, on the other hand, had become a shadow of my former self. I went through the motions, but the fire that once fueled me, at work, at home, in life, was gone. I avoided our friends, dodged family calls, and buried myself in tasks that didn't matter. It was easier than answering questions I didn't have the strength to face. One afternoon, I decided to go for a drive to clear my head. The house felt suffocating, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I ended up at a small park on the edge of town, a place I hadn't visited in years. Sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, I let my thoughts wander. This was supposed to be the life we built together. The career, the house, the quiet Sundays spent in each other's company. It had all felt so solid, so permanent. And yet, here I was, staring at the shattered remains of a marriage I thought was unbreakable. The betrayal wasn't just about the infidelity. It was the lies, the manipulation, the way she had weaponized my trust against me. Every kind gesture, every loving word she'd offered in the past few months now felt like a cruel joke, a performance designed to keep me in the dark. I thought back to the photos and recordings in the folder. The way she'd spoken to him, the laughter, the tenderness in her voice. It wasn't just an affair. She had given him a part of herself that I thought was mine alone. The realization hit me like a gut punch. The Kayla I loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. When I returned home that evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching mine for something. Understanding, forgiveness, maybe even hope. But I had nothing to give her. "Did you go somewhere?" she asked cautiously, breaking the silence. "Just for a drive," I said, my tone flat. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her mug. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She looked so small, so defeated, like someone who had lost everything. But then I remembered the way she had laughed with him, the way she had lied to my face over and over again, and the sympathy evaporated. Without another word, I headed to the guest room, shutting the door firmly behind me. I couldn't do this anymore. Not the pretending, not the half-hearted attempts at conversation. Something had to change, and soon. Lying in bed that night, I made a decision. The time for waiting was over. I had gathered all the evidence, seen all I needed to see. It was time to take control of the situation and of my life. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity, as though the fog of the past few weeks had finally lifted. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a house that felt more like a battlefield, avoiding the woman I had once thought I'd spend my life with. It was time to act. Kayla was in the kitchen when I came down, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. She glanced up as I entered, offering a tentative smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't return it. "I'm leaving for a bit," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. She blinked, setting her mug down. "Leaving? Where are you going?" "I'll be staying with a friend for a few days," I replied. It wasn't entirely true. I planned to book a hotel, but I didn't feel like sharing details. "I need space to think." Her face fell, panic flickering across her features. "Jack, wait. Can we talk about this? Please." I paused, meeting her gaze. "Talk about what, Kayla?" "We've done enough talking. I need action, not words." She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked back upstairs, packing a bag with the essentials: clothes, toiletries, the folder of evidence. When I came back down, she was standing in the living room, wringing her hands. "Jack, don't go," she said softly. "We can fix this." "I know we can." I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman I had married. She looked so earnest, so desperate, but I couldn't ignore the reality of what she had done. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk," I said simply, brushing past her on my way to the door. The hotel I found wasn't fancy, but it was clean and quiet, and that was all I needed. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pulled out the folder, flipping through its contents one last time. Each photo, each recording, was a reminder of how far she had gone to deceive me. It hurt, but it also strengthened my resolve. That evening, I made 2 important calls. The first was to my attorney, laying out the situation and discussing my options. He assured me that with the evidence I had, the divorce would be straightforward. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. The second call was harder. It was to my parents. They had always been fond of Kayla, treating her like part of the family, and I knew this would devastate them. Still, they deserved to know the truth. When I explained everything, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then my mother spoke, her voice tight with emotion. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Mom," I replied, my voice steady. "I just thought you should know. We're here for you," my father added. "Whatever you need." Hanging up the phone, I felt a surge of gratitude. At least I wasn't going through this alone. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a support system, people who truly cared about me. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, I made a vow to myself. I would get through this. I would rebuild my life, piece by piece. And no matter how hard it got, I wouldn't let Kayla's betrayal define me. The following morning, I woke to find several missed calls and texts from Kayla. She was clearly unraveling, her messages swinging wildly between remorse and defiance. "Jack, please come home. We need to talk. Why are you punishing me like this? Haven't I suffered enough? I made a mistake, but we can fix this. I know we can." Then came the guilt tripping. "You're abandoning us without even trying. I thought you were better than this." I set the phone down, my jaw tightening. Her attempts to manipulate me were as transparent as ever. She wasn't apologizing because she was truly sorry. She was trying to regain control, to steer the narrative back in her favor. But I wasn't falling for it. Not anymore. By mid-afternoon, her persistence escalated. She called again, and this time I answered. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling. "Please come home. Let's talk face to face." "I told you I need space," I replied, keeping my tone firm but calm. "You had plenty of chances to talk before, Kayla. You chose lies instead." "That's not fair," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared of losing everything we've built. And yet, you risked it anyway," I shot back. "You didn't think about losing everything when you were sneaking around behind my back." She fell silent, and for a moment, I thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her words barely above a whisper. "I love you, Jack. I know I've hurt you, but I never stopped loving you." I let out a bitter laugh. "You don't treat someone you love like this, Kayla. Love isn't lying or cheating or using someone's trust as a weapon. Whatever this was, it wasn't love." Her voice rose, tinged with desperation. "It was a mistake, Jack. One mistake. Are you really going to throw away everything over this? One mistake?" I repeated, anger bubbling to the surface. "Kayla, it wasn't just one mistake. It was months of deception, calculated lies, and disrespect. Don't try to downplay it." She started to respond, but I cut her off. "I need time to think, Kayla. Don't call me again unless I reach out first." Without waiting for her reply, I ended the call. That evening, as I sat in the quiet of my hotel room, I replayed the conversation in my mind. Her words, her tone, her attempts to rewrite the narrative. It all solidified what I already knew. Kayla wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she got caught. For a brief moment, I felt the faintest twinge of sadness. This was the woman I had once loved, the woman I had built a life with. And now, she was just another person I couldn't trust. But that sadness was quickly replaced by resolve. I couldn't let her words sway me. I was moving forward, and nothing she said or did would change that. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. "Let's move ahead with the paperwork," I said. "I'm ready." The next week was a whirlwind of final decisions and preparations. My attorney worked quickly, filing the paperwork to formally begin the divorce process. The evidence I'd collected ensured there would be no debate about the reasons for the split. Kayla's infidelity was clear, documented, and undeniable. When the papers were served, Kayla called almost immediately. Her voice was a mixture of shock and anger, but I let her words wash over me without engaging. She accused me of giving up too easily, of not fighting for our marriage, but I knew the truth. I had fought for us every single day before I knew the betrayal. She was the one who had thrown it all away. In the days that followed, I began reclaiming pieces of my life that I hadn't even realized I'd lost. I reached out to old friends, people I'd distanced myself from while trying to keep up the illusion of a perfect marriage. Their support was overwhelming. Their words a reminder that I wasn't alone. I also started taking better care of myself, physically, emotionally, mentally. I went for long runs in the park, cleared my mind with each stride. I booked a session with a therapist, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to ensure I came out of this stronger. Piece by piece, I was rebuilding, rediscovering who I was without the weight of Kayla's lies. The moment of closure came 2 weeks after the papers were served. Kayla requested one last meeting. For clarity, she said. I agreed, not out of hope, but because I needed to hear whatever final words she had to say. We met at a neutral spot, a quiet cafe downtown. When I arrived, she was already there, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I sat down, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of warmth. I gave her none. "I know I can't fix what I've done," she began, her voice trembling. "But I just want you to know that I regret it. All of it. I was selfish, and I let my fears and insecurities destroy what we had." I listened, not interrupting, but not offering her the comfort she seemed to be searching for. When she finished, I nodded. "Thank you for saying that," I replied simply. "But regret doesn't undo the damage. I'm moving on, Kayla, and I suggest you do the same." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. For the first time, she seemed to truly understand that this was the end. We parted ways quietly, without anger or drama. Just two people who had once loved each other and now stood on opposite sides of a broken bond. Walking out of that cafe, I felt lighter. The weight of betrayal, the anger, the sadness, it was still there, but it no longer defined me. I was free to start again, to build a life on my own terms. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope. As I drove back to my temporary apartment, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the city. It felt like a sign, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there's always light. And I was ready to embrace it.